Okay, folks, I think we're going to make a start. A very warm welcome to the Dean Speaker Series. And of course, I'd be remiss if I didn't say Happy Valentine's Day to everybody. How are you all today on this wonderful day? Has anyone said I love you to you? No? Well, we're going to say it collectively together, right? Can we all say it together? I love you. Oh, you guys are enthusiastic. And on a more serious note, love and respect is actually one of our key values as a business school. So if you can look up the others, I'd love you to do that. But so anyway, but happy Valentine's Day. It's lovely to have you here. The Dean Speaker Series, why do we have this? We have this every quarter, and we invite a person from the business community, from the political community, from the civil society community, to come in and speak to us about something relevant in their worlds that they believe students would like to hear about and know about or should know about in terms of preparing you well for the future. And of course, it's about leadership, exposing you to leaders in their various communities who are taking leadership positions in important areas that, that we believe are important. So this series is really a terrific series. And I say this because even though it's called the Dean Speaker Series, it's really the Mark Openlander and Kate Barker series. They're the ones that organize it out of the Center for Applied Learning. And they're just terrific at really working to make education, and the education we provide here at SBGE in the School of Business, Government and Economics, relevant and exciting and important for you as you prepare yourself to launch from this place. So thanks to Mark and Kate for organizing this, and I also want to thank Charity Osborne and Annie Cato for promoting this in their classes. So I believe we have an HR class and a business law class here today. Is that right? So welcome. Yeah, thanks for coming and being here today. It gives me great honor to introduce Mr. Joshua Cooper to you today. He currently is a senior manager at PricewaterhouseCoopers on the workforce of the future, and he specializes in particular in consulting around diversity, equity, and inclusion matters. Joshua is an alum of SBGE, so this is exciting. We don't often get to welcome a Dean Speaker who's an alum. More importantly, he's an accounting alum, and I used to have the privilege of teaching him. I mean, I can't believe it. Now it's completely the reverse, right? Have you heard of the concept called reverse teaching or reverse mentoring? Now it completely happens the other way. So I love to get together with Joshua and really just learn what's going on out there. Also, Price Waterhouse was my first job as well, out of college. So we've always had various things in common like that. And I really do mean it when I say I love to work with Joshua, because and he's really become, I mean, I don't know whether he would ever say I was a mentor to him. I don't know whether that's true. I would never claim that, but certainly he's now become a mentor to me, and so that's the neat thing. And this is part of the role that he has outside of his current work in terms of his many volunteer roles, and he's currently on the Executive Advisory Board of the School of Business. And so that's a group of people who advise our programs on curriculum, provide a bridge into the business community and other communities, and just speak directly to students, come and speak in classes and that kind of thing. So we're very grateful for his leadership and his help on our Executive Advisory Board for our School of Business, Government and Economics. After he left here, he did do some more education, and he got a Master of Tax with kind of a joint time with Notre Dame and then finally at UW. And he started off as a tax accountant in Price Waterhouse, but then soon quickly realized a little bit of time and developed other passions. And of course, Price Waterhouse is such a very eclectic firm that there's so many other opportunities you can pursue. They're not just a state-owned accounting firm anymore, but you'll hear about some of his work that he does there. When he was at school here, he was the president of Begin. Used to be called OSBE back then, different name. And so he was very involved in student clubs and coming alongside students, just wanting to organize and help students succeed as they left SBU. And then he was very entrepreneurial. He ran a talent agency called Dream Catchers, which was phenomenal. I mean, we would go and he'd come and talk about accounting, and then, oh, by the way, I've got make this call to, I'm an agent for so-and-so or whatever, and I thought, goodness me, what the heck? This guy's running a talent agency for Hollywood and other film outlets and media outlets called Dreamcatchers, and he was running his own accounting firm. And I thought, goodness me, does this man ever sleep? But he's just a very entrepreneurial fellow. And then as he left the tax world and got into Price Waterhouse, he also was constantly exploring, well, is this for me? And he then also studied and passed the Foreign Service exams and was thinking of going to work for the State Department. And he's going to perhaps put a little one of the twist on that endeavor too, and then decided ultimately against it, and then has developed, and Price Waterhouse realized what a talent they have, and they wanted to get behind him and try to keep him instead of working overseas for the State Department to work in Price Waterhouse, and that's what he's doing now. He's had a lot of other volunteer experience. He's, as well as the executive advisory board of our School of Business, Government and Economics. He's also on the board of Disability Rights of Washington. He's on the steering committee of the Diversity, Equity, and Inclusion Community of Practice that's sponsored out of the Gates Foundation and other large organizations bringing DEI professionals together here in the state of Washington. He was served for a period of time on the Campus Housing Alliance, which is as the treasurer, and he's also been an executive board member of Out and Equal, which is the premier inclusion organization for LGBTQ+ across the US really and across the world. So he's had so many varied experiences, and you know, I guess the best compliment I can pay Joshua is he's become a really good friend, and it's that reverse mentoring thing that I so appreciate. So we try to get together at least 2 or 3 times a year. Often he brings out the Price Waterhouse credit card and takes me to Palisades or something fancy. So that's pretty fun. Although I had to pay today for lunch, right? What's happening here, Joshua? Anyway, without further ado, it's an absolute privilege for me to introduce to you Joshua. People, let's give him a warm welcome.
Well, thank you, Ross. That was a very nice introduction, and it makes me feel very old. Hello, everyone. As Ross mentioned, my name is Joshua Cooper. My pronouns are he, him. I am a white man with a blue and white checkered shirt, wearing a blue jacket and short red hair. And I want to acknowledge before we start today that we're standing on the stolen land of the Duwamish, the Squamish, and Snoqualmie peoples. That might not be your normal introduction that you hear every day, but that's because I work in the field of diversity, equity, and inclusion, and so I want to make sure we are accessible by providing visual descriptions, providing land acknowledgements for the stolen land that we're on with indigenous peoples, and providing my pronouns as well for those to understand that it's a safe space to identify however you want. Today we will be using Slido, which is technology that will allow you to submit questions that you want throughout the session. So feel free to point your camera on your cell phone to this QR code. You can also just go to slido.com, and the code is SPU. And this will allow you throughout the session again to answer or submit any questions you want, and I'll also be using it to ask you all some questions and have you submit your answers on there as well. So please make sure to pull that up. You can submit questions with your name on it, or you can submit questions anonymously if you don't feel comfortable having your name on it. So please feel free to utilize that tool however you want. Did everyone get that? I'll show it a couple more times throughout the day as well. So you'll see when you get on there, there should be a question asking what your major is. So I just want to make sure that everyone has access to the technology and has no questions. So go ahead and submit your major. So, Introductions. I already kind of covered who I am. You'll notice everyone hopefully has a name tag that you were able to write your name. There were identity stickers up there. This is an exercise I do a lot with C-suite executives when I'm holding kind of leadership workshops with them to help them understand different dimensions of identity, right? And there are some dimensions of identity that you can see that are visible and others that are not visible that you would have seen on those stickers. And so just so you all get to know each other a little bit, I want you to find 3 other people, so get in clusters of 4, and introduce yourself. I'm going to have you, I'll come back to this, but just introduce yourselves with your name, your pronouns, what your major is, and then the one identity sticker that you put on your name tag that's the most important to you today. Understanding that different dimensions of identity may flex and be more important to you some days than others. So go ahead and find some groups and introduce yourself. So again, this is an exercise I'll do with a lot of executives. I like pull them together for DEI workshops because it allows them to get to know each other on a personal level. And I've seen sometimes people that have been working together for 10 or 15 years learn something about their colleagues that they didn't know through this exercise. And so thanks for participating in that. I want to go back to this slide. So just some ground rules for today as we have some conversations around diversity, equity, and inclusion. We always want to make sure we're creating a safe space for this. So a few points, always speak from the I perspective, speak from your own personal experience, and never project your experience onto other people. Make sure you're being present. I know I maybe risked that by telling you to get your phones out and scan the QR code, but please try to be present during this time today. Honor confidentiality, so if someone does share something during today's conversation, please don't attribute that saying to their name when you leave this room. It's okay if you want to talk about themes generally as you leave, but we want to make sure that we keep that confidentiality in this room today. Be aware of the space you're taking up, including non-verbally. Assume positive intent. This one we always balance with assume positive intent, but also understand the impact you make, right? And so the metaphor I'll always give is if you get in an accident with someone, right, and you make impact with someone, the first thing you do when you get out is don't get out and go to the person and say, well, I didn't intend to hit you, so hope you're okay, right? The first thing you do is make sure that the person and everyone in the vehicles are okay. So we want to make sure we're acknowledging that impact regardless of intent, but assuming a positive intent as we go through today's conversation as well. All lived experiences and emotions are valid. Lean into discomfort. Sometimes these conversations can be a little uncomfortable and we want to get comfortable being uncomfortable, so lean into that. And then lastly, respect silence. And I always will acknowledge that sometimes people don't have the words for what they want to say, and that's okay. And so that's why I try to utilize technology through Slido to allow you a forum to provide any thoughts you might have as well. So we did this. So this is our identity wheel, and so you'll see a lot of the things on here around dimensions of identity will tie to the stickers that you had in the exercise we just did. Understanding that us human beings are unique individuals that are made up of many different experiences and many different dimensions of our identity look different. So in the middle there you have personality, which is really what makes each one of us distinct human beings. And the circle outside of that, you have fixed dimensions of identity, which are traits that are typically fixed, but can sometimes be fluid. You'll see gender identity, sex, mental, physical activity, ethnicity, race, sexual orientation, and age within that circle. From there, you expand a little more to variable dimensions of identity, and these change over time, like education, appearance, religion and spirituality, socioeconomic status. So understanding that throughout your life, these things will change and different dimensions of your identity will change. Organizational is really work experience, tenure, your level within an organization, where in the region you're operating in for an organization. So how do the organizational cultures impact you as a person when it comes to your different dimensions of identity and how you show up in the world. And then lastly, you'll see cultural, which really shapes the broader context in which we live and in which we work every single day, right? So you're seeing body language, time fixed or time flexible, right? So some people just culturally, if you show up to a meeting late, it's normal because they're time flexible and they're just willing to go. Some people that really annoys them because they're time fixed and they're on a very tight schedule, right? So it just depends on different cultural nuances. Individual or team-based, conflict resolution preferences as well. So this is just kind of a general understanding of how different dimensions of identity shape who we are, how we show up in the world, and our experiences. So my story, Mark had asked me to kind of give my journey of life and how I ended up here today, which was an interesting exercise. And so we'll go ahead and start with, I was born and raised in Corona, California, about an hour outside of Los Angeles, a very diverse community. I have one brother, his name is Jeremiah. He's 18 months younger than me. And he has Down syndrome, and he's definitely shaped my view of the world and how I experienced life through my family's involvement for disability rights throughout the states of California and Idaho. Because just as I was entering high school, my family moved from Corona, California to Coeur d'Alene, Idaho, which is very different places. So LA is very diverse, Coeur d'Alene's not so diverse, and just very different culturally. So I graduated high school a year early to get out of Coeur d'Alene, and I went to Hamlin University in Minneapolis, originally as a musical theater major. I thought I was going to be on Broadway. But then I wanted job stability. So I transferred, I actually took a year off there, and that's when I started Dreamcatchers, the talent agency that Ross was mentioning. And we had an office in Spokane, and I wanted to open up an office here in Seattle. And so I transferred to Seattle Pacific University, came over here to Seattle to open that office while attending SPU and graduating in accounting, because I wanted to be able to do the books and the accounting myself for my company. So I was here at SPU, and then graduated at SPU December of 2013, which is 10 years ago now, which is crazy. And then during that time, I got an internship at PwC in their tax practice. And so I interned for about 9 months in their financial services tax practice, where I got to really start seeing what it's like to be a CPA at a very large Big Four firm, and what tax busy seasons look like, which means you have no life essentially for quite a while. And so I did that for 8 to 9 months, and then went to Notre Dame originally for grad school. During that time at Notre Dame, I was only there about a month and a half, 2 months, and South Bend, Indiana is very different than Seattle, Washington. And so I missed Seattle, and I called UW and I said, hey, will you please let me into grad school? And they said, we're starting next week, so if you can get here, you're in. So I packed up all my stuff at Notre Dame that night and then started driving the next day back here. And then went to UW and got my master's in taxation. And that was a really pivotal moment for me because, going to Notre Dame, I think I felt a lot of expectations, and my parents were very proud as a first-gen student for both undergrad and then going to grad school and getting into Notre Dame, which was the second-ranked Master's of Accountancy program in the nation at the time. And there were definitely a lot of emotions I was going through internally of, are people going to feel like I failed? Am I letting people down? But it was really the first time that I paused and took a look at what I wanted and what was going to make me happy, and made that choice for myself to come back to Seattle and go to UW, which is still an incredible school, especially their Masters of Taxation program. So came back, did the Masters of Tax, and then started at PwC right after that. So I took my CPA exams. I took them all in about a month and a half, which was crazy.
Doesn't like another slide.
Okay,
This one.
well, that's perfect. That's in here.
This one. Whatever reason.
So there I am. Oh, look at how young I look. So graduated from UW, and then, like I said, joined PwC full-time in our financial services tax practice, doing taxes for hedge funds and private equity funds, which I knew nothing about, but I learned very quickly. As you see here, tax season is when taking a lunch break feels like a vacation, because many times you're just working while eating at the same time. So I very quickly realized that that was just not what I was going to do for the rest of my life. Not that there's anything wrong with it, I just personally didn't feel like it was aligned with my purpose and why I was put here on this earth. And I loved coming from SBGE, where we believed another way of doing business. I don't know if that's still the slogan, but right, where we can use business as a tool to help advance society and our purpose. And so, as Ross mentioned, I had told him that I was going to go work for the State Department, but in reality it was actually the CIA that I was interviewing with. And went through a 1.5-year process with the CIA to get my security clearance. It was a very arduous, long, insane process. So for any of you that go through it, just be prepared mentally, emotionally, in all aspects. But it was a very interesting time in my life, and I think it opened up opportunities for careers for even accounting majors that I never would have thought, right? But I was very transparent with the firm that I had gotten this conditional offer of employment. The FBI does a very thorough investigation of you when going through that security clearance. And so they actually came to the firm and met with a few partners to interview them and ask them questions about me and my character and who I was. And so they were very involved in the process. And so finally, when it became time for me to get my security clearance and leave, I told the firm, it's time for me to go. I'm going off to the State Department. And they said, please don't. We know you're really passionate about diversity, equity, and inclusion. And so what if we make that part of your day job here at the firm? Would you stay? And I said, yes, if you can make that happen, I will stay and I will not go to the State Department. And so that's what I did. And I ended up working internally in our Office of Diversity and Inclusion, where I was managing all 7 of our employee resource groups, which we call ERGs. And you'll see most medium-sized companies, large companies have ERGs. These are kind of formal pockets within the organization for different demographics of employees. So they'll have ERGs for women, Black employees, Latinx, Asian, LGBTQA+, veteran, and disability are typically the common ERGs you'll see in an organization. And so I was managing all those for the Bay Area Northwest market. So I oversaw San Francisco market, Seattle, and Portland. And so I got to go to a lot of events, a lot to speak on a lot of panels representing the firm for diversity, equity, and inclusion. And then during this time, though, it was only a third of my job. So I was doing a job split. So I was doing taxes for 2/3 of my job, and the other 1/3 of my time I was spending doing that D&I work. And it was a good way for me to kind of put my foot in and see, do I really want to make this big career change? Because it was quite a big career change from doing taxes for hedge funds to focusing on diversity, equity, and inclusion. And after about doing that for 2 years, I realized, yes, I don't want to do any tax work. I really just want to focus on doing DEI work fully. And they then wanted to create a consulting practice around diversity, equity, and inclusion. And they asked me to join that consulting practice to build that out, which is what I've been doing for the past 5 years now. And so I typically can't talk about my clients and the work I do, but this one is public, so I can talk about this one, which I'm happy about. So one of the projects I've worked on for the past 3 years is something called the ACT report, which stands for Action to Catalyze Tech. My client Snapchat really wanted to bring together the tech industry and say, how do we 10 times DEI outcomes in the tech industry? And so for about a year and a half, we created an academic think tank with people from Harvard and Stanford and UCLA, Google, Snapchat, PwC, obviously, to kind of write this report. And so we met every 2 weeks for 2 hours for a year to write this report. It's a 160-page report, so we know most people won't read it, but we do a DEI Innovation Summit that kind of brings the report to life and the recommendations that we have in that report. And then I was lucky enough to go to Parliament and speak at Parliament in terms of the ACT report this past June with Snapchat, my client, which was an amazing experience as well. So that's kind of my story in a nutshell on how I've gotten to where I am today, from being an accounting major here at SPU to now practicing diversity, equity, and inclusion and doing management consulting. Again, if you have any questions as I'm going through this, please submit them in the Slido, and I'll be taking a look and answering those as we go and at the end as well. So I thought it'd be good to kind of ground us in what is diversity, equity, and inclusion. What do these topics mean, right? So we're going to use Slido, so make sure to have this open. There's the code again if you need it. And I'm going to go ahead and push this question because I would love for you all to tell me in Slido, what does diversity mean to you? How would you define diversity? And the great thing about Slido is if someone submits a response that you agree with, rather than writing it again, you can just click the like button and it will move it up towards the top. So we're seeing different backgrounds, representation of different people groups. People with all different backgrounds, variation in experiences, culture, ideas, and individuals to allow for broader representation. I'm loving these. So I think a common word we're seeing here is different, right? Different backgrounds, different people, different experiences, different cultures. So I'm now going to go ahead and push another question to you. Can a person be diverse? It's a simple yes or no question. Can a person be diverse? Okay, so seeing lots of yeses. The answer is no. A person cannot be diverse because diversity is relational. Diversity only exists when you can relate it to something else, right? So diversity is the presence of different within a given setting. I, as one person, am only one thing. You have nothing to compare me to say there's difference within me, right? So for purposes of workforce diversity, these typically include but are not limited to ability, age, ethnicity, gender, race, sexual orientation, and religion. The reason I asked you that question previously is because when I'm working with executives a lot, they'll say, you know, we want to hire a diverse person. And I'm like, be specific with what are you looking for? A racially diverse person, someone from a historically underrepresented group, with Black, Latinx, Asian? Are you looking to hire women or non-binary, right? Like just be specific with the language because language is really important when we work in diversity, equity, and inclusion. So that's diversity. Now let's go ahead and talk about inclusion. And I will push this question to you. And I'd love to hear your thoughts on what does inclusion mean to you? Seeing welcoming. A safe space for people to be included, creating outlets for different underserving communities, listening, creating space for everyone, celebrating diversity, I love that. Respecting all people regardless of gender, race, sexual orientation. I love this, you all get it. So inclusion, the definition we often use is people with different identities feeling and or being valued, connected, and welcomed within a given setting. So when we talk about inclusive culture, which we talk about a lot, we're talking about one in which a mix of people can come to work, they can feel comfortable and confident to be themselves and show up as they are, and work in a way that suits them and delivers the business as well, right? Because we're all there to serve the business. So inclusion ensures that everyone feels valued and most importantly can actually add value as well to the organization, the culture, the team, etc. And then one question, can you have inclusion without diversity? Yes or no? I love seeing the results come in and go back and forth, back and forth. So, can you have inclusion without diversity? The answer is yes, and typically you'll see the most inclusion without diversity, right? Because they're all people that are alike, they think the same, so they're all going to feel included. And so the reason I'm asking these questions is kind of tie together when we say diversity, equity, and inclusion, why are all three lumped together, right? And some of them have certain types of relationships, like this one, that you can have inclusion without diversity. So, next question is equity. What does equity mean to you? And no, I do not mean shareholders. This is the hardest one, I will say. I see fairness of outcomes rising to the top. People with diverse backgrounds have their needs met. Equal opportunity. So as I mentioned, equity is typically the toughest definition we talk about because the practice of equitable outcomes is not easy because typically all systems and processes that we are operating within are built on inequities. So equity recognizes that advantages and barriers exist and that they impact our access to experiences and opportunities. And so you'll see this chart right here, right? Equality is giving everyone the same thing, but by giving everyone the same thing, you see that not everyone can actually access the opportunity. Equity is giving each person just what they need in order to have access to that opportunity. And so it's a process that begins by acknowledging the inequality and then continuing to correct the imbalance by addressing the differing needs and providing for those needs accordingly, as the image shows. So it doesn't mean necessarily giving everyone the same thing, but rather giving every single person what they need in order to live equally and happily. Again, this is the hardest one. When we talk about this in corporate America and DEI, you'll typically hear pay equity. I think that's the easiest, most known term in terms of looking at pay for gender, race, and seeing is there equal pay in the organization. Many times there's large disparities because people will start out within a company making less than other people that have the same skill set, same job title, etc. So, can you have equity without diversity? Yes or no? So, for this one, yes, you can have equity without diversity because, again, if you have a homogeneous group, everyone likely has the same needs and they're starting at the same place, and so it's equitable outcomes you're seeing within that homogeneous group. You're all very smart. So what does management consulting look like? What do I actually do on a day-to-day basis? So a lot of what I do is, at the base level, a very common engagement we'll have is something called a current state assessment. And that's when we come into an organization and we assess as an organization, where are you at with your diversity, equity, and inclusion? So a lot of times what I'll start with those is I'll do executive one-on-one interviews with all the C-suite officers and sometimes the board of directors to understand what is their pulse on the organization when it comes to DE&I, right? I'll ask them what their vision for success is for the organization in terms of DEI, where are you trying to go, and what are the challenges you're anticipating in reaching that success. We'll do focus groups with different demographics of employees. So typically depending on where the organization is focusing, we'll do focus groups with Black employees, with Asian employees, Latinx, LGBTQ+, et cetera, to really understand what's the different experience of different groups within the organization and around sentiments of inclusion and belonging. We'll look at employee engagement survey data, which is each company will typically survey their employees at least once a year. Typically now that's much more frequent because if you wait a year to feel how your employees are feeling and then fixing things, your employees are likely gone by that time. So you see a lot of companies doing employee engagement surveys once every month, once every quarter to really get a sense of sentiment of inclusion and belonging. This right here is representation and movement within an organization. So what we'll also do is look at the data from their HRIS system, which is like Workday is the most common one. And we'll look and see what are the hiring rates, the promotion rates, and the attrition rates of women and non-binary people, Black, Asian, Latinx, et cetera. So really looking at it from a disaggregated perspective to understand what are the experiences that the data is showing us, and then also where does the organization need to focus. And this is really important because a lot of times we'll see organizations focus heavily on hiring, but when you look at the data, it's the attrition that they need to focus on, and they need to focus on retaining their people rather than hiring. So we're able to kind of steer our clients in terms of where do you need to be focusing your DEI programs and for which communities. We'll then take that data once we have the hiring, promotion, and attrition rate and project it out and say if you continue doing everything that you're doing today, 5 years from now, this is where your representation is going to be for women, LGBTQ+, et cetera. Many times organizations now have committed DEI goals publicly and they've said we want X percentage of women, X percentage of BIPOC employees at certain levels within the organization, and so this allows us to tell them whether or not you're going to reach that goal or not. Most times they're not going to reach the goal, and so we have to help them understand what levers can you pull and what programs can you put into place to make sure that you are reaching those goals by the dates that you've shared. I shared the ACT report already. As I mentioned, we know most people will not read it, so we do a DEI Innovation Summit every year. So I've got the pleasure of being able to work with Idris Elba, Trevor Noah, Kiki Palmer, Gina Davis, some amazing people in the space that we have speak around DEI in the tech industry. So that's a fun summit we put together every 2 years in November. And then last week I was at Brazil speaking on a panel for a client that was launching 6 ERGs globally. So I was in Sao Paulo for that. So that's kind of a high-level snapshot of what I do in a day-to-day of management consulting. It's a lot of working with executive teams, board of directors. So I would say that's a skill set you definitely need when it comes to management consulting, because they're the ones with the power and the authority and influence in the organization to really change the culture, policies, processes, etc. So now the future of work, which I know Annie is so tired of hearing. But why should you care? Why should you care about inclusive leadership, right? Inclusive leadership is a critical skill to being a purpose-led and values-driven person in the 21st century and beyond. As we know, technology is continuing to play more and more of a role in the jobs we do. So a lot of people are asking, like, is technology going to replace people, especially accountants over the past couple of years, right? We've been automating a lot of work. Who knows what that logo is? What is it? ChatGPT, yes, which has been, over the past couple months, a lot of people talking about it, right? There's a lot of HR business partners that are typing into ChatGPT, I need a job description for an accountant, and then it pops it out in 30 seconds versus them spending hours writing it, right? So the question is, will it automate jobs completely? Do you still need people? The answer is yes, you're always going to need people to make decisions, to be able to analyze the data, make sure the data going into the system is correct, and making sure that the technology as it's being built does not have biases and inequities built into it as well, right? Technology is going to change what your work looks like, how you do your work, and because of that, I think people skills and inclusive leadership and how you interact with other people is going to become even more important, because you're going to be shifting time working on the technical piece to actually working with people across different cultures, backgrounds, regions, etc. So, skills needed for the future. Don't tell anyone at PwC, but this is a McKinsey source. But I thought they laid this out very well in buckets, right? You have the cognitive, the interpersonal, self-leadership, and then digital. So that digital is really where all that technology piece comes into play. But you'll see in the interpersonal and self-leadership, a lot of that inclusive leadership behaviors that we're looking for around building empathy, inspiring trust, humility, fostering inclusiveness, motivating different personalities. So understand, how do you motivate people that have different love languages in the business world though? How do you resolve conflict? Understanding your own emotions and what may cause you to react in certain ways. We don't use the word trigger in DEI, so that's why I didn't want to say that. But integrity, courage, and risk-taking, etc., right? So you're seeing a lot of companies build out L&D curriculums, learning and development curriculums, to upskill and reskill their people to have these skills specifically, understanding that the future looks much different than it did the past 10, 15 years in terms of how we work and who you're working with. And so how do we equip our people with the right skills to make sure that they can remain with the company, right? Because they have the historical knowledge of the company institutionally that is really valuable. So I would say, as you all are kind of looking towards your next journey, as you graduate and go beyond SPU, right? It's like looking, how do you harness these skills? How are you tapping into developing these skills here at SPU, which I know your professors and the school is focusing on. But these are going to be really important because it also allows you to open up the horizons of your own career, right? I know people at PwC who have been with the firm for 20 years and they've had 4 or 5 different careers, even myself, right? Like I started in taxes, doing taxes for hedge funds and private equity funds, and now do something completely different. But at the base of it are these skills that allow you to shift. Anyone can learn new technicalities of different jobs, but these skills are really important to have to be able to experience many different careers within your lifetime. So we're going to use Slido again in case you need it. There it is. I would love to hear your ideas around what professional means to you. And this is because we've recently had this conversation at the EAB level around professionalism and what does that framework look like. So I'll go ahead and activate this question. And just in your own words, whatever comes to mind when you think, like, what does professional mean? We're seeing courteous, respect, acting ethically. The way you carry yourself. Interpersonally equipped to succeed at work. I like that. Responsible. So this word professional, in DEI, we react to it very strongly because who dictates what professional is and isn't, right? How you show up, how you talk, how you communicate, what you wear, how you interact with others, right? Who gets to dictate that? And so professional is really a term used to describe the behaviors that are deemed acceptable by a certain culture, right? So within a population, what does that population deem acceptable? And who gets to make that decision? It's the person in authority or has the decision-making power, right? And so professional looks very different depending on the industry, the organization, the group of people that sets those social norms, right? So in the tech industry, when you go to Amazon, a lot of my friends are wearing Lululemon shorts and t-shirts and Nikes, right? But when you walk into Wall Street at a finance organization, you're going to see people wearing suits and ties, very different attire, right? The language is also likely very different. I'd say tech is much more casual. Sometimes there's cussing. Sometimes it happens at Wall Street too, but just the language that is acceptable as well is very different. And then manufacturing, right? It's a very casual environment. You're going to see people wearing jeans, Carhartt, other wardrobe that you might not necessarily see in other industries. And so understanding that professional really is again, deemed acceptable behaviors within that organization. And so I want to empower you all to like find what organization, what culture feels the best fit for you, right? And don't ever, personally, I'm like, don't ever let someone tell you that you're not professional, right? Because to them, maybe you're not, but to someone else, you are in another organization. And so what you're seeing organizations like PwC do is actually define what does professional mean to us at PwC? What are the behaviors that we are deeming acceptable and that we want our people to exhibit to show professionalism to our clients and in the communities we operate in? And so we've picked 5 dimensions of what a PwC professional is. And at the core, you're seeing whole leadership, right? The ability to lead yourself and lead others within the organization and our clients. You're seeing relationships, so the ability to develop relationships steeped in trust with your coworkers and the clients as well. Business acumen is really understanding how does the business of PwC work? How do we bill our clients? How do we invoice them? How does the firm keep running as a business? Technical capabilities is actually knowing your stuff, right? So if you're in tax, you actually know how to do taxes. If you're in audit, you actually know how to complete an audit for a client. And then lastly, global acumen. So we actually assess our people on being inclusive and being able to work with people of different backgrounds and cultures. And so these 5 dimensions are what we say as a PwC professional and how we assess our people and how we assess their performance every year as well. And so historically, right, it was not professional to talk about race, religion, and politics. Those 3 things 10, 15 years ago, you just did not talk about in the workplace. I think over the past 3 years, especially during the pandemic, people realized, especially as everyone was working from home, if you had a job that allowed you to do so, that you were seeing people's personal lives, right? And that we're all people, we're not widgets or bots. And so we have human emotions that we can't just check at the door when we walk into work. And so you're seeing more and more employees having these conversations around race, religion, politics that typically haven't. You're seeing 65% of employees have had those conversations. So 2/3 of people, this is a PwC survey, luckily. The impact of these conversations were overwhelmingly positive compared to the negatives, right? So you're seeing 80% said they at least had a positive interaction, whether it allowed them to understand their colleagues more, whether it created a more inclusive work environment for them, whether it helped them process their own views or increase their empathy as well, right? So these conversations are going to continue being had. I think the door is open, and I don't think we're ever going to shut it back, especially, again, acknowledging that we're all human beings with emotions that we can't just check at the door when we go into work. And so cultural dexterity is this term that we typically will use a lot rather than professionalism, right? The ability to adapt in different circumstances, understand what is the acceptable norms within that group, and have that dexterity to integrate into that culture. So this is a leadership skill that really encompasses the ability to understand, to manage, coach, work, interact, connect with, and effectively communicate with people from vastly different backgrounds and across multiple dimensions of diversity. And I think this is a large skill set you're seeing a lot of companies focus on because they want to make sure that you're able to work with many different people effectively, you're able to communicate with them, you're able to adapt and flex as needed. So some things to consider as I leave you before we open up for Q&A. As you all graduate here and start looking at what the next chapter of your life is, I would say it's so important to interview a company as much as they're interviewing you, right? We spend more than half of our life at work, and so you want to make sure you're spending that time at an organization where you feel that you can be yourself, that you're being accepted, that your thoughts and the value you add is being recognized at an organization. And so some things to think about in terms of assessing the culture and seeing if it's a good fit for you. Notice things like, what time do people get in the office? Does everyone come in at the same time, or do people kind of stagger in? So do they have a flexible work environment, or is it very rigid? At PwC, there were people when I was in tax that would come in at 7:30 because they had kids, and they would leave at 3. I am not a morning person, and I never will be, so I would stroll in around 10:30 and leave a little later. But knowing me and who I am, I could never work at an organization that wanted me to be there at 8 a.m. every day. It just would not work. So asking those types of questions, looking at what people are wearing in the office, ask whether they do team happy hours, bonding events. Some people, they want to come in and just do their job and leave. Others want that connectivity with their teams and find it really important to developing trust and being more productive, really. So looking at that, noticing are doors closed for the offices, or are they open? At PwC, pretty much everyone's office doors are open. We have an open door policy to where anyone can walk in unless I'm in a meeting or something, I'll close the door. But noticing stuff like that, even the partners and executives at the company. Ask how they develop their talent. So do they have a culture of upskilling their people and investing in you and your own leadership development, or do they want you to take care of that personally? Seeing if you see people that look like you in leadership roles and management roles in the organization as well, especially from a diversity, equity, and inclusion standpoint. Asking the question of, is the culture individual-based or team-based, right? So how is performance evaluated? If the team has a win, is everyone celebrated, or is it only certain people that contributed? So again, looking individual or team-based. And then risk-averse or risk-tolerant, right? So if you're risk-averse as an organization, you're likely not going to be innovative and around very long. But if you are risk-tolerant, that means you're accepting of that risk and you are hoping to be innovative as a company, right? At PwC, we have this term called fail fast, which means we want you to take bold risk and try something new. But if it's not working, fail quickly, recognize that, and pivot and adapt as needed so that you can continue to be innovative. So with that, I'll leave you with this quote of, if you can't be who you are where you are, then change where you are, not who you are. Again, finding the right organization and culture for you as you all venture out into your careers. So with that, I think we have like 10, 15 minutes for questions, Q&A, and I can look at the Slido to see some of the questions here. How do companies set and pursue diversity hiring goals without violating anti-discrimination laws? Yes, so it's all in the language. Quotas are not typically legal unless you have affirmative action plans, but that's why you see goals and aspirations. Those words are used a lot with organizations because it's not a mandatory quota that you have to meet as an organization, or otherwise you would open up yourself for legal action around anti-discrimination. So language is very important, which is why we covered like what does diversity, equity, and inclusion mean, because words are really important.
Can I ask for clarifying?
Yeah.
Just because like, we're having these conversations a lot in HR, right? And so am I correct that those are high-level goals that wouldn't necessarily say for this position, gotta be this, check this demographic, right? But to inform so that you're always thinking about those goals in your hiring, but it's not down to the individual decision. Like we're gonna say it's gonna be 5 of these and 5 of those.
Exactly.
Yeah.
Yes.
Yeah, that you cannot do. You can have policies that require diverse slates, right? So at least there has to be a diverse slate of people interviewed. But to your point, it's not saying that this position has to be filled by someone that is a Black woman, right? Yeah. Let's see, some other questions. What are some of the limitations, impediments for an organization to be transparent about their DE&I practices? Every DEI is a journey, right, individually and organizationally. And I would say it depends on where the organization is at in their DEI journey and honestly what leadership in the organization, where they're at individually in their journey. Going back to risk averse or risk tolerant, some organizations, legal is very strongly behind them, and when DEI team goes to them saying, we want to do this, legal doesn't say yes or no, they say, okay, let's find out how to help you do that. So legal is a big part of it in terms of being transparent about their DEI practices. But in my experience, it also is just the executive team as a whole. Where are they at individually in terms of wanting to push the organization towards more mature DEI practices, or are they really focused on the business at the end of the day and not caring about DEI? Any follow-up questions to that one? Is it possible the PowerPoint can be shared with you? Yes, I can share it with you. How do you manage your job and your personal life? This is a really good question, I think, regardless of whatever career you're in. It's a constant balance that I think at different points in your life you do better at than other times. When I was in tax, I definitely threw myself into my career the first 2 years, and I was working more than I needed to, and I definitely burned myself out, which I think why so quickly I was like, I'm done with taxes. I never want to see a tax return ever again. But I think a lot of it is personal boundary setting. My advice whenever people start a job is to show up how you want people to respect your boundaries like the first day. Because if you show up in an organization and you're taking on everything just to like try to impress people, that then becomes the norm and your brand of, okay, Joshua's going to say yes to everything I ask him to do. And it's very hard to shift that narrative after you've been in the organization and established that brand. So I think it's hard. I think it's also finding time to take the time for yourself. I took a 6-month sabbatical last year, which was not an easy decision. There were a lot of questions in my head of would it affect my career progression and promotion through the organization? Is the team like going to realize they don't need me? Luckily, it was the opposite. They realized how much they needed me. But I think there's a lot of fear with taking some extended time off, but I think it's recognizing that you need that time to refill your own cup. Right, as a flight attendant say, put your mask on first before assisting others. Like you have to make sure you're okay. And so I think it's just having those conversations internally with yourself, making sure that you're communicating transparently with your teams. You know, if you want good work-life balance, just making sure that your managers are aware if you have a kid that has something going on, right? Like I think if you give them context many times, it allows people to support you on your team with providing you the time, the flexibility you need, etc. To the extent you're comfortable disclosing that information. Any follow-up questions about that? I feel like that's, again, a constant struggle for even the teachers in the room, right? Like, how do you manage life and personal? How did you get into management consulting? I hope I answered that one. Are there any questions about that one, though? I'm very lucky to be at PwC. That's a very big firm that allowed me to switch into that group though, right? Can you get access to the slides? Yes, I will share. Do you think that too much of people's personal lives being included in professional environments can possibly be a negative thing? Where would you draw the line? I'm not sure I know how to answer that question. Also, if you're comfortable for whoever submitted that, if you want to maybe give me a little more context as to what you're asking.
Yeah.
I guess like if somebody has a personal life, but it's really without excuse for them to not be as active, like in their teamwork. Does that become like a harmful thing? Or is there like a limit we should put on how much we can excuse a person from contributing if there's like issues going on with their personal life?
So you're talking about like maybe, so like the example that's coming to mind is like working parents. Sometimes people who don't have kids in the workplace feel that parents get off easy because they're having to take time off to go take care of their kids, et cetera. So they're maybe not, it doesn't appear that they're putting in the hours that everyone else is who's at the office late, whereas other people leave at 6 o'clock. I think, again, that's a bias and a perception that people have. At the end of the day, I think each individual, it's up to you to disclose how much you want to disclose to your teams, right? Brene Brown talks a lot about vulnerability, right? And vulnerability it's a process of an individual going through and saying, how much do I disclose? How much do I not disclose in terms of how much I'm being vulnerable with you and sharing with you about my personal life? We don't show up on day one and say, here's everything, right? There's kind of a process of trust that is developed in the relationship before you start sharing. But yeah, I mean, I think that's a hard one because I think it's up to every individual to kind of figure out how much they disclose, do they feel the need to share, and then how they balance kind of perceptions as well. What is a DEI policy or practice you've seen that really stood out to you? It's a good question. There is one that a very large company did for their law firms that they contracted with, where they said, if you don't meet these requirements that we have for X percentage of our attorneys are women or people of color, then we're withholding 10% of the payment and we're not paying it to you. Which I thought was very interesting and a good way to use your influence as an organization to push down DEI initiatives into your suppliers, right? We call this supplier diversity in terms of what other companies are you contracting with and how can you use your sphere of influence and power to bring them along the DEI journey with you. And not paying people always gets people's attention. So yeah, I always thought that was an interesting one. Any other questions? I'm happy to just open up. Those were a lot of good questions on Slido. Yeah, Mark?
Can I ask a question? I'm curious, since you work with a lot of different clients, if you're seeing that your clients, especially those leadership people, are more or less open to DEI initiatives, and do they see the value in it? I mean, for a while, we had a sustainability speaker, for example, last quarter. She talked about some companies are very much want the appearance of sustainability and greenwashing, but they don't really want to do the work. Do you see a sea change in that at all? Is it getting better?
Yeah, I will say, obviously, I think society went through a huge shift after the murder of George Floyd, and you saw a lot of companies all of a sudden. It was amazing because the pandemic hit and no one had money for DEI, right? Everyone was cutting DEI teams. And then after the murder of George Floyd, all of a sudden these companies had like millions of dollars to throw at DEI. And I think over the past 3 years, I have seen a lot more people involved in the conversations than historically have not been involved in the conversations. Granted, though, I will say that my clients are paying hundreds of thousands, if not millions of dollars to us. So typically my clients are very invested and they want to do the work, and it isn't so much performative. But there are organizations where I do think it is extremely performative and it's easy for people, even people that are potentially interviewing at those companies, to see, because when they look at the leadership of the organization, it does not reflect a diverse society, right? So yeah, I mean, I think we're getting there. Every organization's at its own spot on their DE&I journey, but it has been good to see, again, more people involved in the conversations than historically have been. Any other questions? Yeah.
I agree with the question. I'll just read out because we didn't get there. You know, I was reflecting on your comment. It seems to me like there's a tension between, on the one hand, not changing yourself, but changing the place, right? And then on the other hand, this idea of cultural flexibility or adaptability being a really key skill for the future. So can you speak to that tension?
Yeah. I think it's figuring out, so there's primary culture and subcultures. I think it's, in terms of not changing who you are, I think it's making sure that the primary culture, how you interact on a day-to-day basis, is one that you feel valued, seen, and recognized, and that you're not having to change yourself in that primary culture on a day-to-day basis. I do think cultural dexterity, we are all going to have to flex in certain situations to adapt, but you only want to be in that zone for a certain amount of time before you can pull yourself back into your primary culture where you feel safe and comfortable. And so I think that is the tension between the two, and just making sure that, yeah, you're not putting yourself in a situation where you're having to every day change who you are and how you show up. Yeah, Mark?
I was going to say, as a follow-up, wouldn't part of that being I don't have to change my core values,
Yeah.
what I believe and what's really bedrock for me?
Yes, yeah. Values of an organization is really important, and it's also really important to see, are they just stated values or are they lived values, right? So every company is going to have stated values on their website, but then are the values actually lived in the culture and the behaviors every day, as we talk about, again, primary culture and subcultures. Any other questions? Okay. Well, feel free to come up afterwards. Happy to chat. And I will send these, well, Mark has these slides, so he can
I
send
can
them.
get them to the two professors, and if there's anybody who's not in one of the two classes, either Dr. Osborne or Dr. Papa, I can get them to you individually. Email me. I want to thank Joshua for his time and a small gift on behalf of the School of Business, Government, and Economics. I will also say the ACT report is online and free to read, right?
Yes, you can go to actreport.com.
I actually read it because I'm a nerd. It took me like 2 months to read it small chunks. It is so worth it. It is really fascinating. You will learn a ton, and the work that this group has done on it. Anyway, thank you for being here.